let's see. Could you state your name, your date of birth, and place of birth?
My name is Norris Einertson. I was born on August 6, 1930, near Westbrook, Minnesota.
And did you live in Minnesota most of your life?
No. I lived in Minnesota for 3 years while I was in seminary, and then I went, but before that I had lived on a farm for about 24 and a half years before I started college, and then have just moved back to Minnesota in July of this year. Most of the rest of the time I've been elsewhere to study or to minister, or of course many different places where the Army sent me over nearly 29 or a little over 29 years of active duty.
So you went to seminary a little later in life.
I did. The only thing I wanted to do when I when I left high school was to farm. The opportunity was there. My father was about ready to retire. I did farm for 6.5 years. I really felt the call to ministry the fall after I was graduated from high school. But it wasn't what I wanted to do. I wanted to farm, and I did, and I think I was fairly good at it, but God wouldn't leave me alone. I sometimes say that I spent 6 years fighting with God from a John Deere tractor. Finally, God won, and I'm glad that he did. Usually, if we try to follow the will of God, things work out better for us. They certainly worked out better for me.
And then so you decided to go into college and then seminary?
That's correct, yeah.
And what seminary did you go to?
Luther Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota.
And what denomination do you represent?
Evangelical Lutheran Church in America.
Yep, one of the Lutherans. Huh?
Yeah.
What was your first assignment, North?
Fort Riley, Kansas. I was assigned to 1st Infantry Division. My first 20 months I was with Division Artillery. Then they sent me to the 2nd of the 16th Infantry Battle Group. And the purpose for doing that was that we were supposed to go to Germany. Well, we did go to Germany for 6 months, and we were supposed to have reinforced the Berlin Brigade. Well, as it turned out, we really never got to Berlin, so we spent, it turned out to be 7 months in Wildflecken, a small post about 10 miles from the East German zone, where we kind of sat around and watched the Russians and the East Germans for those 7 months. And then back to Fort Riley, Kansas, and then I was assigned to Support Command. And so I got a pretty good look at the division for having been in Division Artillery, a battle group, and Support Command. And that's the total of the first assignment.
Yeah, that all within the same division. That should give you a good picture of what the division's like.
I did, and I only was served with a division one other time, and that was later on. I became the 1st Armored Division chaplain in Germany for 26 months.
And what years was that?
That was 1976 to 78.
When did you go to the chaplain advance course?
Right after I came back from Vietnam, 1969 to 70.
Okay, that was the year I came on active duty.
Oh, really? Yeah.
So where were you in Vietnam?
What was the question?
Where were you in Vietnam?
I was down in the Mekong Delta. I was assigned to the 34th Engineer Group. We had 5 battalions in the Delta, 2 combat engineer battalions and 3 construction engineer battalions. And so we really covered the entire Delta, and covered all 4th Corps, which was essentially the main Mekong Delta.
That must have been some interesting fighting with the tides that come in and out of the Delta.
Well, there was some of that, yeah, and of course it was the Viet Cong were the primary adversary in the Delta. But farther north, it was mostly the Armen, I think.
Yeah, you didn't have much Armen at all down south.
I don't think so.
No.
The primary division, there was a 9th Infantry Division, which was stationed at Mito. We were down flew a lot all over the Delta.
And so you were there with the same unit for the entire year?
Yes.
Okay. And was there a lot of combat in the time that you were there?
Not a lot. We didn't have a lot of it where we were. Yes, there would be alerts at night sometimes, and you'd pick up your flak jacket and your helmet and head for the bunker and that's type of things. But otherwise, no, we didn't see a lot of combat. We did lose a few soldiers down there, but not a lot.
Okay, and then you went after Vietnam, you went to the career course.
That is correct.
And then where'd you go from there?
Fort Ord, California.
Oh.
I was with, well, interestingly enough, when I first got to Fort Ord, I went in to get my assignment, and Chaplain Sullivan, the post chaplain, said, Norris, you're going to be going to an assignment that will not be very personally rewarding. But it's an important assignment. The commanding general is concerned about it. They're burning down buildings over there. There are a lot of riots, and they burned down two the first week I was there. Didn't burn down any afterwards, but that's and he'll be there. He said you'll be there for not over 7 months, and he was as good as his word. And then I was transferred to a basic training brigade. But the reason why I was assigned there initially, well, he had to fill a slot, huh? But I spent almost, headquarters command. That sounds pretty wonderful. But what it was, I spent almost all of my time in something called the personnel control facility. And these people were just one step away from jail, and they would have been in jail except that the stockade was full. And the interesting thing about them, every morning they'd have what they called a body count. And they had about 1,000 on their record, 1,000 all men on their record. And if they could count 600, that was a pretty good day. The rest of them were all AWOL. And somebody designed a unit crest. It was the Roadrunner.
That sounds like an exciting assignment.
It was. And one day short of 7 months, I went to 1st Combat Training Brigade, which was the rest of my tour there.
And then where did you go from there?
I went back to the school and the staff and faculty.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what did you teach in the staff and faculty?
Well, I was sent there as a writer.
Ah.
And so I was always in the non-resident department, but my official title was Chief of Reserve Components. And interestingly enough, after I got all through with my military career, I began to see that, the Army had really assigned me to almost every facet, almost every level of the Army. I'd served at battalion, brigade, group, division, corps, major command, Department of Army. The only thing I hadn't touched were the armies, which of course were the reserve commands. But when I was at the school, I was Chief of Reserve Components. And so if there is such a thing as career development, maybe I was the recipient of that.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
There aren't too many careers that follow that kind of pattern.
Well, mine didn't follow probably in the order in which
Right.
some people would have liked, but it's the way it was.
And after the school, where'd you go?
Went down to Fort Gordon, Georgia, and I was assigned there for almost 4 years.
And what did you
That
do
was
at
the
Fort
sixth-
Ord?
Well, I started out as the in the post chaplain's office. Eventually became the deputy post chaplain, and then I was promoted to colonel while I was there, and became the post chaplain. And it was at that time that the chief of chaplains invited himself to Fort Gordon, and we went in my office, and he closed the door, and he said, which full colonel job in my office are you interested in? I said, I'm not interested in any of those jobs. I've got a good job right here. And he left me alone for 15 months. But then by that time, he'd learned how to ask questions. So at a training conference out in St. Louis, he invited me to his hotel room, and he said to me, are there compelling reasons why you can't come to Washington? And I had to say, no, there weren't. It was 6 months. I was in the chief's office as the executive officer.
Yeah, that's quite a job, being doorkeeper for the chief, huh?
It was a good job. And the best job in one sense, in that you kind of get to see how the whole office works.
Yeah.
You're not confined only to personnel or plans or programs or logistics, you know. You get to see it all.
And when were you chosen for brigadier general?
In December, 1st of December of 1985.
And was that right out of the chief's office, or did you?
No, the chief sent me down to Forces Command as a senior chaplain there on the 15th of April of 1985, and 7 months later is when I was promoted to brigadier general and assigned as deputy chief chaplains.
And who was the chief when you were deputy?
Pat Hessian.
And when you put on your 2-star and became the chief, when was that?
1st of July 1986.
I remember those times very well
I'm
when
sure
you were
do.
chief.
Of course, you were there at the board part of that time
Right.
in Washington D.C. and helped us with a lot of things. You really did.
No, you had a kind of neat perspective and a unique perspective on what was going on in the Army in those days.
No, I hope so.
Yeah, and one of the things that was happening is you had to do a lot of conversations with the rest of the Army staff.
Yes, we did.
Yeah. What were the biggest problems that you faced as chief?
I think mostly defending resources, and primarily personnel resources, because they were always trying to draw down forces, and of course the Army financial pie is only so big, and what portion of the pie we had, somebody could take, I suppose, and everybody was trying to do the same thing, I suppose. But yeah, we had a lot of fights about that, but I think we did pretty well during those 4 years. We grew the chaplaincy by almost 100 people during those 4 years, even though there were attacks on it many times.
Yeah, I remember being in the trenches for some of those fights.
I know. You were very helpful to us. You were assigned to the chaplain board. What was it called in those days?
Agency.
Agency, yeah. But, and of course the other thing, you were up on the DA staff too.
Right.
And you fought very hard for us there on many different issues. Of course, one of the other issues had to do with the what am I looking for now? Well, the issue that practically every chief had to fight was they were always trying to place the chaplain corps under the assignment branch of the deputy chief of staff for personnel. And I remember you were very helpful to us because you were up on the DA staff at that time.
Yeah.
And you were fighting the battle at your level. And you'd come down and brief us, of course, what was going on up there. And that was very helpful.
Yeah, those are some different, interesting things. Everybody wanted to take the chaplaincy under them because I think they saw the power of the branch and didn't want to fight the power of the branch.
Yeah, that's probably true. Yeah.
Did you enjoy your time as chief?
Oh yeah, very much.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, after I became a civilian, I became a pastor of a church for a while, and of course, pastors of churches always get funerals. And on the way to the cemetery one day, one of the cemetery people, who was also a guardsman out there in South Dakota, asked me, weren't you frightened with all of these assignments that you went to? And I said, no, I don't think I ever really was, because I kind of figured, well, if I couldn't do the job, they'd just have to go out and find somebody who could do it better. And so we just went along, and you know, I had a wonderful 29 years on active duty.
Yeah, there were some assignments I had that I really didn't want to go to, but when I got there, it turned out to be really good.
Yeah.
So,
I even went to one assignment one time when the post chaplain didn't want me. And he thought I was there as a spy for the chief's office, and I didn't know anybody in the chief's office. I became the plans and programs guy there, and we happened to have a post-wide program that I managed for him that turned out pretty well. And from then on, he began to realize that I really was trying to work for him, and I was, and I got a decent efficiency report out of it from him because of that. Because I had nothing against him, and as I said, you know, the program is the important thing, and that's what I emphasized with the other chaplains who really didn't want to go along with him.
yeah.
I said, forget about that, forget about him right now. We've got a job to do for the spiritual life of these people here, and that's what we have to do. And I got some of them on board that way.
Well, you were chief during a real transition period for the whole Army, you
Yes.
and Pat Hessian too, because after Vietnam there was a lot of early retirements and SEER boards, and there was a real change in a lot of personnel policies. The Army was kind of demoralized coming out of Vietnam, so leadership was a real problem. What did you see as one of the biggest transition problems the Army had coming out of Vietnam and moving on?
Oh, I suppose just restoring the proper attitude toward military service, probably. And it had kind of degenerated to a very bad place during Vietnam. Vietnam became a very unpopular war, of course. And then we began to see, what's the best way to put this? There was a lot of reaction against the military in our country. There were many of the soldiers, of course, were kind of rebellious at that time. And I saw that really changing about the time I got to Europe, which was 1975. And the Army then, a few years later, began to be funded well too. But I remember the battalion commander, friend of mine, who became the G3 of the division later on, and he was one of the brigades in the 1st Armored Division. And he said, you know, when I was a battalion commander there, we flunked every inspection we ever had. Well, it obviously wasn't his fault. He did make full colonel, because I think many of the units were flunking them. But there was a turnaround that took place about that time. I had nothing to do with that, I don't think, but it's just, that was the time when the Army started to get over Vietnam and the unpopularity of that war.
And about in the 70s, though, we were going through real problems with drug abuse.
Yes, yes,
And you were in Europe, and Europe it really was bad.
yes.
Yeah.
You know, I'll give you a little bit of perspective on drug abuse. When I came into the Army, I was at Fort Riley, Kansas, 1961 to 65. Never counseled a single soldier who spoke of having a problem with drugs. Went to Panama for 3 years. When I got there, about half of that battalion was smoking marijuana. I mean, just a month apart, you know. And then most of these soldiers rotated out. And they were replaced by a group of people that President Johnson thought ought to have an opportunity to serve in the United States Army. And they were big into drugs. And they then became replaced by a group of people who were generally older, generally draftees, often married. The drug problem went away.
That was McNamara's Project 100,000.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. And then they were finally replaced by some of these same people that you just mentioned, and the drug problem was right back there.
Yeah.
So, that was the genesis of the drug problem in the Army as I saw it, maybe in mid-1960s.
And you also, when we had real problems with race relations.
We did, yeah.
And what role do you see the chaplaincy playing in the race relations?
Oh boy, I don't know. I think we just had to be sure that we were fair, and we tried to be fair in chaplain assignments and things of that kind. I had some responsibility, not the total responsibility, obviously, because I was only one member on a five-member board where we elected the first black Army chief of chaplains, who succeeded me, Matt Zimmer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think some of the things with race relations, we had garden plot and stuff where chaplains were assigned to units who were going to go in case some of our cities exploded. And I thought that was I thought the chaplains being involved in that was good.
Sure, right.
When I look back over my time in the chaplaincy, I see that every time the Army got in crisis, it looked to the chaplains corps to help them out with race relations, drug and alcohol abuse, marriage and family counseling, organizational development. And is that kind of your experience too?
Yes, I think so. When I was at Fort Ord, I was selected as one of, I think, 5 chaplains around the Army who went to a meeting. It was really a meeting of Army doctors, psychiatrists, psychiatric nurses, I guess it was. And of course, the drug problem was big here, early 1970s at this time. And I recall a colonel from the medical corps saying to the whole group there, the Army has told us that we need to solve this problem, and they've given us unlimited resources. And that sounds good, but now we have to produce. Because they weren't quite sure what they were capable of. In fact, they were quite sure they were not capable of doing that any more than we were as chaplains. You just work at it on a day-to-day basis, of course.
But I think the chaplains kind of bring hope to the situation.
One of the other things that you and I worked on together was the accommodating religious practices.
Yeah.
That was a big kind of thing, and they had to do mostly with, help me if I've forgotten some of them, diet, the wearing of the uniform, and
medication, burials.
Burials, yeah, but there was another one too.
Diet.
Diet, uniform, dress.
And diet.
Yeah, okay.
The Jews and the other folks got
Yeah.
separate rations and stuff.
Yeah, and I think in the Army we finally got that solved pretty well. And eventually it was also transferred to the other services. And I remember one of the proudest days of my life, I guess, when I went to a meeting where the representatives of both the Navy and the Air Force were there, and the Army program was described. And finally, I believe it was the Secretary of Defense who was running the meeting, and the Air Force representative said, well, we can follow the Army position. Well, the Navy wasn't so willing to do that, and he said, the Secretary of Defense said to him, I think you better look at this Army program. So it was a very thankful day for us in the military, not for us personally, but I think because we accommodated people of various denominations.
Yeah.
Jews, Seventh-day Adventists, a number of other people. people who had special needs for dress, Sabbath observance. We didn't mention that early on.
Yeah.
That was part of it too.
Yeah, I remember that very well. I was on the desk first committee looking at that, and one of the issues on uniform was nobody really wore the same uniform. Everybody had accoutrements on it. And I told the Undersecretary of Defense, I said, sir, if you looked, there were 4 Marine officers talking about the same uniform, and each of them were in a different uniform at that meeting.
Yeah, I guess the way I put it at one of these meetings, the military seems to go out of its way to ensure that we aren't wearing exactly the same uniform.
all the way down to pregnancy BD battlefield uniform.
Yeah.
Well, you had a great career, and I think you were a great chief. And
I appreciate that.
yeah, of all of the things that you remember, what are some of the things that are the fondest memories for you?
Oh, I just have to go back and say that probably the fondest memory was when I finally surrendered to God and decided to become a pastor. And I went into, and since I had not served in the military before, I really, from college onward, decided I needed to be a military chaplain. The only thing, and I thought the good reason for this is, see, this was by the time I was ordained, it was 1961. An awful lot of the men in our parishes had military experience. And I thought that my serving as a chaplain would give me a way to identify with these people. And in many of our churches, we may have tried to do some things in men's work, but didn't have much to show for it. So I thought maybe this could help me to do better work with men. The only thing I knew for certain when I went in, I wasn't going to stay over 3 years. And so with about 5 months left on my 3-year commitment, I went to our church headquarters and said, what can I look forward to in 5 months in a civilian church? And we discussed some things that sounded pretty good. And then the church representative said to me, there's only one thing, I want you to stay in the Army. And he gave a rationale for it, and I'm not at all sure fit me, because I don't know whether he knew what kind of work I'd been doing in the military or not, but the rationale was this. He said, a strong church can carry a weak pastor for 2 years. But in the military, you've got 2 weeks to get on duty with your new unit. If you don't do that, the soldiers walk down the street to another chapel where they believe the chaplain better meets their needs. And you demonstrated you can get on board in a hurry. So